Does anybody? Okay, cool. So with that in mind, for POIs, we just like that you unmute, say POI, and I'll determine whether or not to take it. Is it anything different for you guys? Okay, perfect. Alrighty, 7-minute speech for the affirmation. And I will begin my time on my first word. Hi, judges. My name's Maddie Christensen, and I'm the first affirmation speaker on this resolution that this House would require all social media algorithms to be available for public inspection. Let's quickly get into the framework of this round before we get into our contentions as the AF. We're defining public inspection as the resolution defines it, which refers to algorithms being available to view. It does not make it legal to use an algorithm without the owner's permission, but it's making it available to the public view. And this House is the United States federal government, as that would be who is passing this bill. And social media algorithms are, once again, as the resolution states, algorithms used to determine advertisement, user matching, post ranking, post reach, and more. With that in mind, our value for this round is going to be utilitarianism, which means whichever team can prove to you that their side promotes the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people, we ask that you cast the ballot in their favor. With that in mind, I'm going to be getting into the harms and inherencies of the status quo. Then I'm going to be getting into our policy plan. And with my remaining time, I'll be getting into the solvency impacts and just the positive impacts of our case and our policy plan. With that in mind, let's get into the harms and inherencies of the status quo with our first contention. Subpoint A is the importance of transparency. In the status quo, these algorithms are kept private from the public's eye. This is because there are issues with how social media is being ran, with what is being targeted to each person. In 2019, the Department of Housing and Urban Development accused Facebook of breaking housing discrimination laws with ad targeting. And researchers from Northeastern University and the University of Southern California found that Facebook's ad delivery algorithm discriminates based on race and gender, even if that's not what the advertisers intended. They tested whether job listings and housing ads with certain keywords or images would be automatically delivered more often to certain groups, exposing what were previously unknown mechanisms that violate anti-discrimination rules. So what we can see from this is that transparency, judges, is crucial to understanding what exactly these algorithms are doing and how exactly they're working in terms of who they are targeting certain content to. This leads us into subpoint B, which is the political divide. We all know about the political divide that exists in our country. People's opinions have only become more one-sided and poignant, especially with how connected people are to social media these days. And this has only expanded due to social media algorithms being taken advantage of by those spreading misinformation. Hackers specifically attempting to exploit the system have used these algorithms to cause havoc. So the algorithm has been getting misused and hacked, and yet we have no way of regulating it because we are not available to see it. The public is not available to see it. Until it becomes available for public inspection, and people outside of these companies, the companies who are trying to hide the issues with it to avoid intense public backlash, are able to figure out where this misinformation is being fed into the system and how to stop it. And stopping it is crucial because once we stop it, we're going to be able to claim our impacts here today of lessening this intense political divide by lessening the misinformation being spread, lessening just how much is being put out there by these people trying to cause havoc, because we'll be able to stop that in its tracks because more researchers, more people who are educated on this material, people who aren't trying to hide it like the companies themselves are, will be able to see it and we'll be able to study it. So our subpoint C is corruption in social media. Algorithms, robotic content has, in large part, assisted empowered electronic interference, formatting domestic rebellion and facilitating extremism online. So in the 2016 US election campaign, the social media algorithm was abused. Messages created by masked Russian social media accounts that were misinformation posts spread throughout the entire country. The reach of such content turned out to be huge. The 470 Facebook accounts that were known, I'm sure there were more, to have been created by Russian hackers during the campaign, generated content that was shared at least 340 million times. This is the core issue. Absolute and unchecked, these platforms are enabling algorithms to wield enormous power over billions of citizens worldwide. Until we have some basic understanding of how social media algorithms use our personal data, platforms will always be able to resist accountability, and efforts at regulation will be too imprecise to make an impact. This leads us into our policy. Our mandate is exactly what the resolution states. We will pass a law requiring all social media algorithms to be available for public inspection. To elaborate on this, all platforms using algorithms to distribute content will need to develop a standardized public interest API, which is a standard interference for sharing and accessing data that provides a detailed overview of the algorithm distributed on their networks while respecting, of course, concerns for user privacy, trade secrets, and intellectual property. So administration is the US federal government, enforcement is normal ways and means, funding is normal ways and means, and timeframe is the next fiscal year. Let's get into our solvency contention, the positive impacts of our policy, judges. Subpoint A is transparency. In requiring social media algorithms to be available for public inspection, experts and politicians can see exactly what is going on. By disclosing formulas for the benefits of society, open source algorithms allow a cross-section of professionals to examine the fundamental principles at play. The impact of this is that, of course, transparency is good for society, and it allows for reform of the system that is currently happening. Subpoint B is making the world a safer place. With this coding, security researchers can determine whether our personal data was put at risk during algorithmic processing. Human rights organizations can help to avoid infringement on our fundamental freedoms. Academics can dig into these systems for bias. Users have the right to know what inputs are being made both in the algorithms that choose their content and those used to moderate their content. Subpoint C is this plan opens up for future reform. It's not possible to regulate the issues we mentioned in our earlier case without understanding how the algorithms work. When our plan passes, these experts will immediately notice if something is immoral, illegal, or in need of desperate reform, which allows third parties like journalists and researchers to identify trends surfacing across the platform and to hold these platforms accountable. Subpoint D is misinformation. We will be solving the micro-targeting and dark ads on social media. As we talked about, this is a huge implication for our ability to determine false advertising or political smear campaigns and election manipulation. Subpoint E is addiction. A lot of people are addicted to social media because the sneaky way these algorithms show them exactly what they want to see, when they want to see it, because they know what they're going to watch. So by making these algorithms public and facing public scrutiny for these addictive algorithms, we'll be making it so companies lessen the tracking mechanisms used. And subpoint F is censored content, because all social media platforms have policies for censoring content that violates their terms of usage. So what we would be doing is enabling journalists and researchers to understand for future research what sort of contents are more frequently censored, and verify that platforms aren't censoring beyond what they're allowed to do. Thank you.
My name is Katie Doran. I'll be the first speaker for the negative team representing Menlo-Atherton. As for this speech, I'm going to be going over the negative positions, of which there are going to be 3, and then I'll be addressing my opponents. All right. My time begins now. Cheryl and I strongly negate the resolution resolved. This House would require all social media algorithms to be available for public inspection. Let's talk about our first disadvantage, or our first reason why this policy is a bad idea. The first point under the uniqueness, or what's happening in the status quo, is that companies hold sensitive information via their traditional algorithms. Traditional algorithms simply tell a computer what to do, or via their algorithms. Traditional algorithms tell a computer what to do, but AI and machine learning, as more modern developments, require a set of algorithms that enable software to update and learn from previous outcomes without the need for a programmer intervention, which can create a competitive advantage and a lot of valuable IP. Many companies thus opt to classify an algorithm as a trade secret as a first line of defense from IP theft. The A point here is securitization. Companies now use a zero trust approach. The least amount of users are granted access to their quote unquote vault of information as for how their algorithm works. Even their own employees don't have access to this. It's only a very small group of authorized employees who have access to this because of how valuable the information is. Secondly, under the uniqueness, each year social network advertising revenue in the US also amounts to $36 billion, which is a figure that is projected to increase each year as social media gets stronger and stronger, which indicates it's a significant part of our economy. But let's talk about the links, or what my opponent's plan changes about the status quo. The first point here is that companies are going to see each other's algorithms and will likely take or modify algorithms from each other. Now, my opponents have a caveat that's also included in the resolution that says it will still be illegal for companies to use each other's algorithms. However, even so, it's not illegal for you to see this algorithm and gain, quote, inspiration from it, or to do something similar but still modify it slightly. So it's technically different. You're technically not taking it, but you're still gaining those trade secrets in your development of your algorithm. Secondly, this is going to be detrimental to social media companies because algorithms are their lifeblood. Their ability to effectively target audiences' interests, to raise revenue, to show people content or advertisements that they might like relies entirely on the algorithm, which means that the algorithm is the internal link to protecting all levels of intellectual property. So thirdly, my opponents are going to cause an investor pullout when it comes to social media companies. Over $119 billion has already been taken out of investment in Facebook due to Cambridge Analytica, which was a data breach that I will talk about more later on, which shows that investors are willing to pull out money if they feel as though these companies are struggling. Companies are already vulnerable. Shares of Meta, the parent company of Facebook, has already fell more than 26%, a loss that wiped out more than $200 billion off of its market value. But let's talk about the internal links. We're going a little more specifically. I'll get you at the bottom of this question, the bottom of this argument if I have time. Let's go a little more into the internal links. The first point here is the prerequisite to capital. Investment, again, is the prerequisite to businesses generating capital for expansion and is key to sustaining GDP, as foreign investment accounts for a lot of US economic output and 10%, a lot of US output. This is also key to reinvestment, as investment firms invest a lot of their capital gains back into their securities and investments. If my opponents undermine investor confidence in social media companies, they'll be undermining our economy as a whole. Thus, the impacts is the economy. As our economy becomes more globalized and digitized, IP theft and as well as the collapse of social media companies or hurting social media companies is going to have a big impact. Chinese IP piracy already accounts for an estimated $600 billion lost to the US economy per year. My opponents open the door for companies to be stealing each other's IP, as well as foreign nations to be stealing them as well, which is detrimental to the economy and especially to investor confidence, which again is the internal link to the economy writ large. But that brings us to our second disadvantage, which is that of cyber attacks and data breaches. The first point under the uniqueness, or I'll take your PY now.
Okay, so you said the stock fell 26%. Do you know where it currently stands now? Was that like a permanent thing or did it recover?
I'm not entirely sure, but I'm not entirely sure if it recovered at all, but I would say that like Meta has not recovered entirely from that 26% drop. It's not, I wouldn't like negate the fact that maybe it's risen a few percent since then, but it's not as though they were able to recover entirely or very quickly either. It also creates uncertainty, another thing that is bad for investors and hurts investor confidence, even if they do recover later on. Going back to disadvantage 2, which again is cyber attacks and data breaches. First, under the uniqueness or what's happening in the status quo, the first point is that social media companies have a lot of information on users, something that my opponents themselves agree with. They have access to things like your address, your contact information, your personal information, or even your credit card information if it's something like Facebook or Instagram that also has a marketplace. But secondly, cyber attacks are incredibly dangerous, and when they do happen, but they're not too common in the status quo, and breaches can be repaired because the code isn't public. So people are able to like improve their code so that those breaches don't happen in the future, or so that information can be put back into being confidential. However, they're still dangerous when they happen. The A point is that a LinkedIn data dump, for example, resulted in eventually 117 million exposed email and password combinations, which were then sold on the dark web. The B point, or another example, comes from Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scam, in which data from 533 million people was published on a hacking forum in a breach that started in 2019. These are all examples of why data breaches are so incredibly dangerous. But let's look at the links, or why my opponents make the status quo a whole lot worse. Firstly, they release this information, which makes hacks easier and more common. Releasing algorithms tells users or tells hackers what kind of information is used and how it's used in the algorithm, which can show hackers vulnerability in the data or the algorithm, as well as what parts of the code to target different attacks. But secondly, aside from increasing the likelihood of attacks, it also makes it easier for companies to make phishing attacks that are disguised as advertisements to reach targeted individuals. They can create phishing advertisements that are designed to target people who are less media literate, such as senior citizens or other people that they believe are more likely to click on a given phishing attack. But thirdly, this is also a threat to national security because Russia and other countries will attack and spread misinformation. We already know that precedent for this exists. The A point is that a Russian-led cyber attack tried to phish 10,000 Twitter accounts belonging to Department of Defense employees using personal messages that were targeted at specific users, each link laced with malware, enabling the attacker to access and control the victim's device. This shows that like an increase in attacks not only means an individual loss of privacy or an individual like identity theft, but also a national security issue that could harm US military or political interests on the global stage. So the impacts, first, is security and privacy on an individual level. My opponents increase the possibility for fraud and identity theft, but secondly is misinformation and Russian hacking. Increasing Russian hacking is not only a threat to national security and military interests or defense interests, such as with the Department of Defense attacks, but also leads to misinformation. If Russian bots and Russian users are so inclined to spread misinformation, as my opponents themselves talk about, they only make it easier, which, as they say, is going to be bad for democracy and like public trust. Okay, that brings us to our counterplan. Our counterplan is proposed as an alternative to the affirmation plan. We would say instead of passing the affirmation plan, we should pass our counterplan. Our counterplan is that the United States federal government should require all social media algorithms to be made available to the federal government. The United States federal government should require all social media algorithms to be available to the federal government. The difference between the counterplan and the plan is that rather than making these algorithms transparent and publicly available, thus available to all people, including Russian hackers, for example, we will only make this data available to the federal government, which limits the risks. Let's talk about my opponent's case. Firstly, let's talk about their harms. Their A point, they talk about transparency and how Facebook may have bias in their algorithms. Clearly, these issues have already been able to be exposed by the public without transparency because experts were still able to figure it out. Moreover, if there's suspicion, the government under our counterplan will still be able to request an investigation, which means issues like bias can still be resolved without making the data available to the public. But on their B point, they talk about political polarization. Two responses. The first response is that no one's going to read your algorithm when you release it. Like the average individual person is not going to read it. The average individual person cannot even be bothered to read the terms and conditions when they join Facebook, let alone pages upon pages of code or detailed information as for how their algorithm works. The people who are actually going to be looking are hackers and phishing attackers who are looking to exploit this algorithm. The average people are not going to be looking at the algorithm closely enough to be able to identify misinformation. But secondly, to turn this argument, they end up spreading misinformation more due to phishing attacks and attacks by people by countries like Russia. On their C point where they talk about extremism in the 2016 campaign with Russia, again, they only make that issue worse. You can also extend these responses to their solvency arguments where they outline how they're supposedly going to solve the harms that I've already responded to. None of these, that's quite simply not going to be effective, especially when it comes to things like addiction, because again, people aren't going to be reading these algorithms. And for the issues that are actually important in today's round, the counterplan is able to resolve those issues by making sure the government can check back for bias, misinformation, or like illegal or pseudo-illegal actions on the part of social media companies without like making our data available to the public. For these reasons, we negate.
All right, is everyone ready? Judges ready, opposition ready? So just as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be going into their case. I'm going to be looking at their plan, and then I'm going to be going into our case, looking at our plan and seeing which one solved for which, because we've identified a plan here. My time will begin on my first word. Hello, everyone. My name is Hunter Valencia, and today I strongly affirm the resolution that this House would require all social media algorithms to be available for public inspection. So firstly, let's look at the negations case here. So their first contention is that companies hold sensitive information via their traditional algorithms. And they talk about how traditional algorithms tell a computer what to do, but AI and machine algorithm is protected. They say that many companies classify algorithms as trade secrets to avoid IP theft. We have an alternative source that says many companies actually classify their algorithms as trade secrets so that they aren't regulated, because one of the most annoying parts about it being called a trade secret is the government doesn't have access to it. So we defy the idea that these algorithms are meant to avoid IP theft in another reason, in that algorithms don't show the IP. That's not how algorithms work. They're not an information holder, especially when you consider the fact, I'm going to get into this later, that our plans do two slightly different things. Ours go into much more detail about how we will not have any IP theft, while theirs is very generic and doesn't really actually elaborate on this claim. So they talk about how companies now use a zero trust approach and how even their employees don't have access to the algorithm. This isn't a good point that they're making. This is really bad. If the only people that know what the algorithm is doing is a select few of people, especially, I'll get into this later, when we look at the Facebook papers, which might be one of the reasons for their stock dropping. So they said that each year social media advertising, like they make a ton of money and it's a big part of the economy. One of the reasons they make a ton of money is because, as we laid out in our issues, that the algorithm is so addictive, which I'm going to get in here real quick, because they say that it's the lifeblood of their economy, and like algorithms are their lifeblood. It's their lifeblood because it's how they make money. Just look at what happened the last time we learned about advertisements. The Facebook papers. They were internal documents that were leaked in recent months by the Facebook product manager turned whistleblower, who shone a light on the harmful effects that the Facebook and Instagram algorithms specifically had on users, and especially young users. What happened after this information was released to the public? There was immediate reform on the algorithm because Facebook and Instagram knew that they couldn't deal with the scrutiny. One, it shows that our plan is more effective than their plan, because in their plan, they're going to have the US government be the ones who look at this. But when the public is the one looking at it, and they talked about how the average person isn't going to read the algorithm. Of course not. We aren't expecting that. We as the affirmation aren't saying like your average person is going to read it, but your average person can read papers from experts who have read it and experts who have exposed what happened. The Facebook paper were experts who whistleblew, and as a result, there was progress being made. So we can see here that one plan is clearly showing more efficiency than the other. And they talked about how it'll cause a social media investor pullout if these companies feel they're struggling. And they mentioned the 26% stock drop. I'm pretty sure that 26% stock drop, one of the reasons was the Facebook papers and the uncertainty of Facebook continuing in their addictive algorithm process. And two, the fact that stocks falling because some short-term investors panic doesn't actually have any real tangible impacts. So they said that the investment firms will stop investing, but firms will not stop investing just because transparency needs to be involved. Instagram isn't going to suddenly have 0 users because you can now see their algorithm. And I would argue that their plan also is going to have investor firms stop investing under their logic, right? Unless their plan isn't as effective as our plan, which I'll get into later. So they said the economy will be harmed, and we don't really buy this point. But even if this was true, we believe that affirmation absolutely outweighs on impact scaling. We talked about resolving humanitarian issues, stopping corruption scandals in elections because of what our plan does, and making the world a safer place. And they said that there's Chinese IP thefts, but algorithms don't reveal IP addresses. That's not what an algorithm does. Second contention was cyber attacks and data breaches, right? As we talked about, I would like to point out our plan specifically involves an API, and these companies are going to have to create an API for their algorithm that specifically details what everything does, but in no way does it actually reveal information. And if the negation tries to push this farther and tries to get more specifics into our plan, a reminder, this is a parliamentary round. Our plan isn't like crazy specific, but it's specific enough that it provides a detailed overview of the algorithm distributed on their networks while respecting concerns for user privacy, trade secrets, and intellectual property. This was a resolution that is getting ready to be proposed to the House. So it has constitutional legitimacy there, which gets rid of their trade secret argument and gets rid of their argument that information is suddenly going to get stolen. So yeah, their counter plan is that they require all social media algorithms to be available to the US government. One, we don't believe that this is going to be efficient because, as we've seen, the best way to get reform is with public outrage. Because although your average person can't quote unquote read the papers, ours is going to do more than what theirs does. Because what happens when the US government gets access to the reform? Are they going to do anything? Is there going to be any motive to want to do anything? No, because there's no public scrutiny. And they might solve for, I don't know, illegal activities, but they're not going to solve for the addictive algorithm. The US government doesn't care if the algorithm's addictive. The US government doesn't care if there's issues with corruption. They're going to only care about the worst things, which we don't want to do as the affirmation. We want to do more than that. So yeah, their plan isn't as effective, which is why our impacts are going to do better, while they might also run into the same problems they propose. If they believe that the economy is going to get hurt because investors believe the information is going to be more transparent, wouldn't it be hurt under their plan as well? So with that being said, let's look at our case. So the first issue was the importance of transparency. And they said, if these issues were exposed, then you don't need transparency. Oh my gosh, the only reason they were exposed is because there were leaks and whistleblowers who were able to confirm this. If we were able to find 460 actual accounts who were spreading misinformation, imagine how many we didn't catch. Because in our plan, it specifically says that for any of these major advertisers, they need to say where the advertising is coming from. This, you can cross-apply this to our third contention's subpoint D, which was on misinformation. In passing our plan, we will be solving the micro-targeting and dark ads on social media because we have no way to know who is sharing what. Their plan doesn't solve for this misinformation because the government, frankly, doesn't care about misinformation because it's not illegal. Now, as we talked about, our plan is going to be able to detect false advertising, political smear campaigns, and election manipulation because the public will be able to see, hey, that advertisement that was saying this X, Y, and Z came from Russia. Platforms in our plan will have to reveal through the public interest API who is purchasing ads, which group they are targeting, and the content of these ads. This also solves for addiction, something that they don't even talk about because in their plan, if you go with the US government might not care about the addiction argument because they're not the public. The public is the one using social media and who is at stake here. A lot of people, as my partner talked about, are addicted to social media because of the sneaky ways the algorithm shows exactly what they want to see. Our plan solves for this because the algorithm has to reveal how it works. And the last time there was leaks in the algorithm, which was the Facebook papers, which was information released to the public, reform had to be made. Now let's just get through all of the positive effects, right? We solve for transparency better than they do. We make the world a safer place better than we do because human rights organizations can help to avoid infringement of the freedoms. Academics can dig into the systems for bias, and it can determine whether our personal data was put at risk during algorithmic processes. Subpoint C, this is a really important point. They have no access to this, which is that our plan opens up future reform because when the public gets their hands on this information, they're going to be the ones who want to reform it. The government doesn't have the same stake here. Subpoint D was misinformation, right? We solve for misinformation better because the public has more of an interest to want to get rid of misinformation. Another important point was censored content, because politicians want to know. Here was the argument that we made. They want to know if they're being censored more than their adversaries. They won't know in their world, but they'll know in our world. And if the platforms are censoring them more, then there's a serious concern for legitimate reform there, if these platforms are showing political bias. So for all of those reasons, you should vote for the affirmatives plan, because we just do everything better, and they still have to run into the same negative impacts that they proposed in their own opening constructive speech. So they said that most people won't read the algorithm, right? We agree with this. It's going to be experts. The public will react. And for all of those reasons, you should vote for the affirmation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Chen. I'll be the second speaker for the negation. The order of my speech is going to be just a top layer overview on top, where you can just flow that wherever you have space, and then I'll go to the neg case, and then I'll respond to the debate on the case, the AF case. It's no surprise that social media is addicting. It's also not a surprise that misinformation spreads like wildfire on social media. If you told a person, hey, a lot of these, like, for example, the news you read, what the posts that you find on social media are targeted directly towards you, they're not going to be surprised. And the reason for that is that even searching up, like, what are the algorithms of Twitter or Facebook, you can already find that information. People already know that the information that they receive often confirms their biases, and they know that there can be misinformation, right? Everyone knows that misinformation exists because anyone can post on social media. Ultimately, they only have a risk of increasing IP theft and cybersecurity. They really have no solvency when it comes to things like misinformation addiction, right? And that is all solved through the negation counter plan, which I'll touch on later. Ultimately, they only have a risk of creating all these really big impacts. So even if there's a slight chance, which we'd argue there's a huge chance of like cyber attacks and IP theft happening, it's an automatic negation ballot. All right, let's respond to their contention on IP theft. They largely misconstrue our argument and also like fundamentally what IP theft is. They talk about how IP theft is somehow not software. IP theft is intellectual property. That includes ideas, innovations, expressions, and creative expressions. So that very much includes algorithms. And as Katie says, algorithms are key to the lifeblood of social media, and that's why some dominate over the other. The thing is that algorithms are much more complicated than they were 10 years ago. It's not just, oh, if they like this post, then you should show them more posts with this hashtag. Today, it's largely based on machine learning and AI. One, this is not only super complicated that most Americans cannot decipher, but two, this means that this is like very protected property, right? This is oftentimes irreplicable easily, and that is why if these companies were forced to release their algorithms as per the resolution, as per the affirmative plan, which was a resolution, then this would lead to dramatic decline in investor confidence. They also talk about how IP theft. The reason that companies aren't releasing their IP is because they don't want government regulation. Again, that's a logical fallacy, right? That doesn't disprove that this information is really sensitive. Now, I would like to talk about a key example that they hedge a lot of their arguments on, which is that of the whistleblower. This, if anything, proves that their entire argument is non-unique. It shows that the government is key to action, with which, if anything, proves the efficacy of our counterplan, right? Because these whistleblowers are cooperating with the government in order to spur regulation. If they were in clear violation of these anti-discriminatory laws, the government is obligated to take action, right? Also, that proves that, again, the government is the way that we effectuate change. But moreover, like the fact that this whistleblower didn't make breaking news, like there wasn't this huge outrage as there was with Cambridge Analytica, proves that the public has a lot less say than they assume, right? Like I don't know what this was, and most people didn't. Like it didn't spur nearly as much of a conversation. So obviously the whole purpose of the government is to enforce its laws. They also talk about how Instagram, on our link level, they talk about how Instagram won't lose users, but they completely misconstrue our link scenario. Our links are that due to IP theft and cyber attacks, investors will basically pull out of the social media stock market. And this is very key, especially as like companies are already in a vulnerable position, as we said, in the uniqueness, but also like you can extend the fact that these businesses are contributing billions of dollars to the economy. So if they were to collapse, that would lead to like that would lead to like collapse cycles, like how, for example, Knight's Capital loses
Point of
$400 million
information.
in a computer glitch at the end of the neg case, and a computer glitch and new asset bubbles like student loans and derivatives, and a general drawdown conflict escalated and became cyclical, right? So this part of the economy will go into other parts of the economy, and this largely affects the world economy, as the United States social media companies are very pervasive in other nations, and also like increase like poverty and things like that, because the economy has a huge ripple effect. And this is a huge impact that you should be extending through, considering that IP theft already costs the United States billions of dollars each year, and that's only from like Chinese hackers. So you can just imagine other nations. They talk about how they're not going to be providing a detailed overview of the algorithms themselves. Judge, this leads the government to a grand double bind, right? Either one, they're releasing all their algorithms and the details in which these companies will lose investor confidence, and that will basically trigger our cyber attack stuff as well. But also, or two, they just provide general overviews, meaning not only can they be selective because it's very unenforceable, like what even is a like detail, like an explanation of your code, right? In which they can hide parts that may be discriminatory. And in order for even it to be like palatable to like the public, it obviously needs to be very general, because most Americans don't know what machine learning is or don't know how to read it, in which they have no impact because they're not going to be releasing anything more than Americans already know, right? Americans already know that they're receiving information catered to them, and that there is misinformation. Like that's not information that would shock anyone. All right, on the disadvantage on cyber attacks, you can extend this entire argument through, because we tell you that like there's a lot of sensitive information on social media, credit cards, address, contact information, and also we tell you about how like there's this creates huge room for phishing, which is a major reason for cyber attacks, and this reaches target individuals, especially those who are not media literate and often the like most vulnerable on these social media platforms, meaning that like their entire livelihoods can be ruined because their identities are stolen, their addresses found, their contact information, their emails, and their password. That's not only millions of dollars of damage, that's also really detrimental to individual lives. This impact is like far greater than what they talk about, like teens being on social media for hours, which is not even something they can effectuate change over. And also you can basically extend our impacts on Russian hacking. They talk about how the government doesn't care. Like the fact that there's a huge democratic crackdown on this itself proves that this is obviously a huge national security concern, especially for policymakers, showing that the government obviously has a huge stake in like not only whistleblowers, but just regulating stuff. Also, the government, yeah. Also, disadvantage too is like the biggest impact, because the fact that like one data hack can release millions of people's information, ruin their entire livelihoods, like information that could be embarrassing or damaging to their reputation, that obviously they have made a pact with like social media that it wouldn't be released, that is a biggest impact in today's debate round. Also, Congress has held testimony with Facebook and others about their algorithm, which proves that the government cares, which leads us to our counter plan. Sure, the government doesn't have as much access to information on social media platforms as it does right now, and that is exactly why we need the counter plan. We tell you that this is competitive through net benefits, right, through our disadvantages, but in order, like the government obviously has a huge stake. They don't want their national security to be harmed. They don't want this like massive polarization, and like they have to enforce their anti-discriminatory laws, which is why this essentially solves for all their impacts. But onto their case, they talk about addiction. Again, I always respond to this as well as misinformation, and we tell you again, you can extend the double bind here. Either one, they release the actual algorithms, they can't read the code, even though that might be more beneficial for like spotting like discriminatory bias within their algorithms, but that also invites cyber attacks and things like that. Or two, they have their quote API, in which again they have no effect over misinformation, because it's already like there's already consensus about the damaging effects of social media. And also they talk about future reform. I already respond to this. They talk about censored content. Again, like Congress, this is all things that are solved by the counter plan. They will be able to figure out what is censored, and they will have and if anything, the counter plan leads to more detailed knowledge of these algorithms, because these companies are more comfortable with sharing more because they'll be less vulnerable and their investors won't be harmed. Yeah, again, so like basically our counter plan solves for all of this, and either way, they really have no solvency. For this reason, we urge a strong negation ballot.
All right, again, I'm Katie Dorn, first and last speaker for the negative team. This speech is going to be more of an overview of the entire round and not on the line by line. So I would recommend flowing it on a separate sheet of paper or off to the side. But just in general, I'll be talking about our second disadvantage, then our counter plan, then our first disadvantage, then the aff case. But again, I'd recommend flowing off to the side. All right. My time begins now. The biggest impact in today's debate is cyber attacks. Far more important than a teen who spends a couple hours on social media every day is the material reality of individuals who are going to have their identities stolen or their identities threatened, as well as the national security of the United States. This is the most important impact, and before we can evaluate any other level of the debate, you must think about cyber attacks. First, let's talk about why we're winning the cyber attack level. The MD completely undercovers this contention, telling you only that the API will not be specific enough and that this public algorithm will not be specific enough that it will make them vulnerable to attack. This necessitates a double bind, right? Either you don't release enough information, which means there's absolutely no solvency because they don't tell the public anything we don't already know, because people are already well aware that algorithms are addictive, even though we don't have access to the specific code, or they release a lot of information, an actual detailed overview, which is the words that they used in their first speech, which means that there are cyber attacks because it opens up, it releases a lot of information that isn't currently publicly available. The resolution explicitly states, like algorithms, they are indeed going to be releasing their algorithms themselves, which makes us vulnerable to kinds of cyber attacks. So why are cyber attacks the most important impact in today's debate? 3 reasons. First, cyber attacks to the internal link to all kinds of information in advertising. We already tell you about how cyber attacks lead to phishing attacks and certain kinds of targeted advertising, as well as misinformation that's spread by the Russian government. So when they talk about these impacts, remember that before we can resolve those impacts, we need to make sure we're not getting misinformation in from other countries or from malicious hackers. So that means that we control the internal link to the impacts they claim are important. But secondly, this material harm is going to be far worse than addiction. You can grant them 100% of their solvency and assume that they're able to solve for impacts like addiction and even drop our counter plan entirely, and cyber attacks are still going to be more important. Far more important than a teen who spends 3 or 4 hours on TikTok every day is the fact that our military secrets are going to be released, or that there's going to be crimes against those people. Those addresses are going to be released. Criminals are going to be able to find where or find where people live or act as predators against individuals. That material harm is far worse than addiction and also far more irreversible, especially if there's death involved. But thirdly and finally, the third reason why cyber attacks come first is that they implicate international issues on a military scale. We've already seen Russia trying to target Department of Defense individuals. These, if they were able to get control of Department of Defense individuals like computers, which is what they were aiming to do, it could cause literal death on the global scale and conflict with Russia, or our inability to respond to conflicts on the international sphere, which causes an irreversible impact of death that is far more important than any of the impacts they bring out. Because we win cyber attacks, you do not need to evaluate any other level of the debate to cast your ballot for the negation. But let's talk about why we actually win on other levels of the debate as well. And that brings us to our counterplan. My opponents really just try to say that our counterplan is ineffective because the government doesn't have any motivation to investigate. But we tell you specifically that the government definitely does care about things like Russian misinformation. The government has done investigations on these things in the past. Moreover, they also have laws in place that they obviously do not want to be violated. Moreover, Cheryl also tells you that the government and Congress have held testimonies and hearings from social media companies like Facebook, which indicates that it's important to them, given that it's important to their constituencies. We do not need the public to have access to confidential information for there to be action to be taken. This also resolves one of the solvency points that my opponents brought up, which is that of future reform. Future reform is only possible through government action. We enable government action also. Now, on our next disadvantage, where we talk about IP theft, a couple key issues here. First, investor confidence, again, as we all agree, is key to the health of the economy as a whole, but investors will pull out if there's fear due to uncertainty. When my opponents release the algorithms themselves, as the resolution implies, when these algorithms are made public, investors know that they essentially have lost the core trade secrets of their industry. The counterplan avoids triggering the disadvantage because it's not your competitors getting access to the lifeblood of your company, but rather just the government so they can regulate it. But my opponents allow these competitors to have access to these algorithms, which hurt the social media economy by causing investor pullout. Finally, on their case, one key argument that I haven't addressed yet is the issue of addiction. I've already addressed a lot of the issues about misinformation and political polarization, as well as hacking through our contentions. But on the issue of addiction, first off, not only do we outweigh, but people already know that social media is addictive. We don't need a detailed algorithm to show that. I know that social media is addictive when I spend 2 hours scrolling through TikTok. Experts know it's addictive when they warn parents about its addictive qualities. We do not need a detailed algorithm. There's no reason why the plan is key to solving an issue that can already be resolved in the status quo. Passing the plan is a failure for national security as well as personal security too.
Okay. I'll be concluding for the affirmation here today. I have a 5-minute speech, and I will begin my time on my first word. So, judges, what this case has come down to is which side of this round proves their policy plan claims the most positive impacts and keeps the negative impacts down. Let's talk about our main points of clash. Main impacts that both sides of this debate tried to claim, because our opponents didn't really have any offense. Most of their case relies on talking about why publishing algorithms to the public would be bad. In fact, that's all their case talks about. But what positive impacts have they listed? Really none. They try and claim our impacts, but they don't provide any true links as to why sharing with the US federal government will create the same exact impacts. So if we can show you why the harms they say about our case aren't going to be occurring like they're saying, and also demonstrate to you how we can claim impacts listed in our case more than our opponents can, we ask that you cast the ballot for the affirmation. So let's get into it. Why won't these harms be occurring? Our opponents claim the harms of our plan is increasing IP theft and lowering cybersecurity. But A, algorithms do not reveal the personal information on users. B, identity theft is already happening in the status quo where these programs are private, but allowing the public to see these algorithms is going to allow much more scrutiny on these algorithms, on what isn't functioning in them, on how they need to be changed. The social media companies will feel extreme public pressure when faced with a storm of educated researchers across the US pointing out flaws in algorithms, the places where it's weak, where biases are occurring, where corruption is occurring. If these companies are already being hacked, then publishing algorithms is only going to increase our awareness of when these hacks are occurring. And when we said the only reason companies call it a trade secret is to avoid regulation, our opponents completely ignored this. They ignored the part of our plan, our policy plan, that stated that trade secrets and intellectual property will be preserved. They ignored this. So how can IP theft be increased if we aren't releasing anything that can be stolen? That's in our plan. And in the resolution, it states using an algorithm without permission is illegal. So if you steal it, you will get prosecuted. We showed you why these cyber attacks aren't going to be happening as our opponents suggested. They want to give these extreme, unrealistic examples like our military secrets will be released, but this doesn't hold true to the round. Nothing in our plan will release data that can be cyber attacked. It's the algorithms. And these algorithms are already being stolen by people like Russian hackers illegally. But now, with more people able to legally analyze them, we are going to be able to strengthen these algorithms from the hundreds of thousands of new eyes. What our opponents don't have, judges? Which part?
Yeah, so the point of information is about the argument that releasing the algorithms will make it easier for us to spot cyber attacks and also prevent Russian hacking. The second disadvantage is a new argument.
We disagree with this POO. Of course, it's judge's discretion. I'm going to keep time paused for a minute as I explain. So in my partner's last speech, he stated about how we wouldn't be releasing algorithms related to personal information and how this would in turn, because in my first speech, how we discussed the fact that these algorithms are going to be decreasing the chances of corruption, decreasing the chances that Russian hackers are going to be doing this corruption. That was a huge part of our first contention. We believe that this does hold true to our concluding speech. So with that in mind, and the fact that this was reinstated, not only in my first speech where it wasn't rebutted, but my partner touched upon it in his last speech, we ask that judges take that into discretion. So I'm going to find my place and then resume my time. So judges, what my opponents do not have is our impacts here today. We talked about addiction, corruption, political bias, and discrimination in advertisement. Now, political bias is a huge impact of this round. The negation has no route to the ballot to help alleviate political bias, as the public won't get to see if people are experiencing this bias, because the people won't see it. Only the government will be seeing it. Our plan states platforms can use the public interest API to reveal the contents and origins of deleted materials, the amount of time the content was distributed on the platform prior to deletion, and what reached engagement that achieved. So public access to this data will pressure social media companies to move more quickly to delete content that violates their policies and to preserve it for future research. It also enables journalists and researchers to understand what sorts of contents are most frequently censored and verify that these platforms are not censoring content beyond what is allowed in their policies. Our opponents do not have access to these impacts because they are not creating an API like we are per our policy plan. Now, misinformation, we are the only side that solves for this. Our opponents completely ignore our huge impacts of Russian misinformation, which could have potentially costed an entire United States election in 2016. And we provided a clear link as to how we solve for this. We will reveal who is advertising and spreading the misinformation when we release these algorithms. We also talk about addiction. They drop this impact, but this impact is huge. Addiction ruins lives, kills relationships. It's a serious issue of being addicted to social media. It's not just young people going on TikTok for a few hours. It's millions of people wasting their lives away because the algorithms are sucking them in. And we established how we would solve this because the last time algorithm information was revealed to the public, we had major reform. So this is a really big impact, judges, because we are solving for social media addiction that is defining an entire generation of vulnerable and young people. We also talk about discrimination. They completely dropped our point that social media discriminates based on race and gender. So it flows through to the end of the speech. In 2019, we talked about how the Department of Housing and Urban Development accused Facebook of breaking these anti-discrimination laws with advertisement targeting. Our impact is that we, with our plan, are going to be making a more equitable society. So as we have proved that this information, these impacts of our side carry through, and sharing this information with the US federal government isn't going to provide these impacts, they provided no links to how this would actually occur. We ask that you take in mind the positive impacts as of our AF case, the fact that our opponents' harms against our case don't carry through, and we ask that you weigh the harms and the benefits against each other under the value of util and vote AF for this round here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Just give us a little bit to make our decisions.
Is everyone here? Yeah. So I can announce the decision. And it was a 2-1 for the opposition. I guess the scroll can go first. Or I don't care.
Yeah, I can go. Just to explain my rationale really quickly. Overall, I felt like it was a really close round for me. And I spent a bit of time like evaluating the arguments and kind of like figuring out which arguments I felt weighed more impactfully during the round. I feel like this might have made a difference, but like in the AF third speech, I voted the PO like in favor of the affirmation. And I felt like a lot of the negations case rested on this point about cyber attacks. And I feel like instead of, expounding upon like a variety of like arguments and refutes, like it felt like a lot of like the case was based off of those cyber attacks. But then when I looked at the AF case, like you talk about how the whole point is to make these like cyber attacks like public. The algorithms have already been stolen, and public pressure is what like actually creates reform. And I think like specifically those points about like public pressure and how like the government isn't fully incentivized to do anything isn't fully responded to. I think the negation talks about, precedent of past investigations, but, past investigations have like occurred like largely in part due to like public pressure and things like that. And also like in general, if there are things that like, I don't know, the experts or the public can interpret, like that's something that benefits the people more. So I feel like I was kind of weighing that argument over what the negation was saying. And I also felt like their counter plan, like I bought the fact that it didn't articulate clearly enough, like why their counter plan wouldn't explicitly fall into like the same trap, cyber attacks or things like that. But yeah.
Cool. Do you mind if I go next? Okay, so good round. Congrats, everyone. Quarters of TOC, yay. It was a really interesting round. And ultimately, I kind of struggled during my evaluation, looking at the flow and like throughout the round, because it was really hard for me to evaluate any of the government arguments because I felt like the government didn't seem to know what their plan was doing. And when the opposition points that out with the double bind, that's not responded to. And I read that argument, and I also don't know. Like, is it so an API? Like, it seems like no one quite knew the technical side, which is like completely fine. But I think during prep, one thing to do research on is that, and like figuring out how your plan works, because an API is a very broad term, and if you're using that in your plan, you have to explain like what it is and how it's used, because it's like technically just a way for like platforms to communicate with each other. But you have to explain like what is being, like, is this literally just folders of the entire algorithms with like thousands and thousands of lines of code? Is this a summary? And that's the questioning I'm getting from the opposition. It could be done to a higher extent, but I think it's done enough, as not responded to, that I have trouble evaluating the government arguments. But assuming that this is like a reasonably like magical plan where like enough information is out, I end up buying that, like, if there's enough information to like help create solvency for any of the government advantages, like, it has to expose data. And I think on the cybersecurity point, that's the only place in the round I actually get like impacts tied into the framework, because these arguments about like addiction and politics and all of that, like, it sounds bad, but I have no idea how to weigh that and no idea how to evaluate that within the framework of net benefits. So then the more impactful impacts and what the government or the opposition tells me to evaluate is this idea of like military hacks and cybersecurity and like economic loss and IP loss. And they tell me like how much of our economy is being bled away. So I end up buying the like both trade secrets and cybersecurity arguments, because I think that the government fundamentally misunderstands the argument. Like, this isn't about identity theft. Like, maybe that's one byproduct of phishing, but IP, as the opposition explains, is intellectual property. And I think they do a good enough job of explaining that these like algorithms are protected and they are the main value of the company, right? So I buy that, like, their analysis that in order to do the plan, like assuming that it has any solvency, you open yourself up to that. And so, you know, you have some sort of impacts. And I buy that the CP like gives enough solvency on the AF case to like mostly mitigate that. That's what they tell me. Like, it seems like it was thrown in there just to mitigate, which is fine, and it does that. And I don't think it bites in. I think that OP does a good enough job explaining why the government's better. And also the point that like government is actually more effective was not responded to, because there's like more trust between, and there's more information, like this idea of like a summary of what the code does versus the government, congressional like committees, whatever, being able to come through the actual algorithms and tracing is compelling and not responded to. On the POO, I think the POO was actually, I think it was correct, because the idea that the plan allows us to identify leaks faster was new. And I didn't hear that in any of the previous speeches. I thought that was a big argument. So I think that was a good POO to call. I applaud that. But across the board, I think I needed a lot more impacts and like a clear understanding of what the plan does. Like, I would have loved to hear a point of information, just like, I'm a normal person, the plan passes, I log on to this website, what do I see? Yeah. Okay, any questions?
Okay, I guess I'll go next. Yeah, so I agree with what the previous judge, a lot of what you said. I ultimately ended up, looking at this debate and evaluating it as a debate between the AF's case of like transparency leading to more reform, right? Less addiction, better social media companies overall, etc., versus the next argument that transparency will increase the vulnerability and therefore the likelihood of cyber attacks. So on the affirmation, I think The AF spends a lot of time talking about the benefits of what a reformed social media algorithm would provide, but not enough time like fully warranting how this process of review and improvement would take place, and like the role of the public in shaping that effort. Like there were some good arguments about, say, like Facebook reforming its algorithm after a whistleblower leaked some information, but it was not fully fleshed out, right? And that kind of example could have legitimized a lot of your claims that public information disclosure and like just like basically giving this information to the public will actually lead to like legitimate reforms that these social media companies will institute, or that public pressure is enough to make them change. But furthermore, the negation also makes a pretty good case that regular people probably just aren't going to read this algorithm or even care, or that the only people that will care are going to be hackers or foreign actors who would just target any vulnerabilities. And that like if you want to fix the algorithms from discriminating or doing anything illegal, the CP solves by giving the federal government access. But I guess that kind of brings me to the negations argument about cybersecurity, which I'm weighing against this general information disclosure will make the company better. So the negation makes a strong argument that the release of social media company algorithms will increase the vulnerability and therefore the likelihood of cyber attacks. I think it's a pretty straightforward argument. It leads to the impacts of the highest magnitude according to the negation, and the affirmation really doesn't weigh any other impacts against it. They can kind of just try to go for a lot of impacts. I understand where that's coming from. Like we never want to we never want to concede an impact, but I think ultimately that is the one I vote for, right? Military secrets being released, election hacking, all of those byproducts of cybersecurity breaches. And even though the AF makes some arguments that, they won't release that much data, or that'll just be like an informational version of the algorithm, that does kind of put you in that awkward situation because you either have no solvency or you continue to bite into the negation's disadvantages. That's just not responded to as well, right? That double bind argument. And at this point, I'm like, what does the plan do essentially? Which, like the other judge said, it's complicated stuff, but if you just explained it a bit more, it would just give us a clearer idea, and it again just gives you a lot stronger case if your plan is specific. But overall, I guess that's just a brief summary. That's just where my decision lied, right? That weighing of transparency leading to reform versus transparency leading to hacking. I thought that it's going to lead to hacking and all of those impacts, but I will say the debate was close. And finally, congratulations to both teams to making it to the quarterfinals of the Tournament of Champions. You guys are both very, very strong debaters. This was a great round to watch, and to the team that won, good luck on your next rounds. But congrats to all of you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, congrats to you guys. I hope you win the tournament. You got this.
Okay, we'll see.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.